Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, The Impact of Collective Trauma on Children. I am Yaakov Goodman, the founder and director of Epic Family, and we are happy to bring you this webinar in conjunction with Kol HaNeshamot. Before I introduce our guests, I would like to briefly introduce ourselves to anyone who is not familiar with us. Epic Family is an organization based in Israel focusing on the Anglo community, and we do what our name implies. EPIC is an acronym for Empowering Parents, Inspiring Children. We offer professional mentoring for children, and we run a parental guidance center providing consultations, support, and therapy. Additionally, we have an Aliyah Guidance Center, which assists future and recent Olim in finding the right schools and helping them acclimate in their move to Israel. Our parenting programs have become internationally recognized, whether online through our webinars in our Global Parenting Summit, as well as in person, where we have arranged epic parenting seminars in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Due to the necessity created by the war, we established our Emotional Crisis Center, providing vital support to hundreds of individuals. We've served as a lifeline for families displaced from the North or South, for those with a loved one in the Army, and for individuals facing anxiety, fear, and trauma. Our commitment includes offering free guidance, support, mentoring, and therapy for those affected. Kol HaNeshamot, led by Yaakov Lazar and his wife Shelley, specializes in supporting families with children facing challenges like anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicidal thoughts. They provide guidance to parents and family members on effective ways to assist struggling children, offering them essential support. Additionally, Kol HaNeshamot conducts support groups and professional meetings for friends of children who have been victims of suicide. It is our honor and privilege to welcome tonight Dr. Zev Ganz, a distinguished figure in the field of mental health, to our webinar tonight. Dr. Ganz maintains a private practice as well as being a clinical supervisor and instructor at the Family Institute of Neve Yerushalayim. Additionally, he is the Rosh Tzevet of the Lemerchav Kav Lenor Mental Health Clinic in Ramat Beit Shemesh, where his expertise is highly valued. Dr. Ganz is a sought-after speaker known for his insightful lectures, and we are fortunate to have him share his knowledge and expertise with us tonight. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Ganz.
You're welcome. It's really a privilege to be here, and it's a privilege to be associated with such an amazing and essential organization such as Epic. So I'm delighted.
Great, our pleasure, and thank you. And I'm looking forward to tonight.
Yes, as am I.
Maybe we can start off, if you can explain to us in layman's terms, so even I can understand, what exactly is collective trauma and what is its impact on children?
Okay, so collective trauma is a term that's been coined professionally it's been around for some time, and has gained some popularity over the last few years, and it's a term essentially used to explain the psychological impacts of large events on societies. And it's a recognition that trauma can impact both on the individual level, but based off of exposure to a frightening event. But there are also reverberations on a societal level, and trauma reactions that we see acutely at the individual level can also be witnessed on the societal level. So that is the textbook definition of collective trauma. It is trauma that is experienced as a collective through the society. Now, collective trauma
is worse than an individual.
So it's hard to say that it is better or it's worse. It's different. So trauma is an overused term nowadays, right? You go to the mosach and the mechanic yells at you, and you come back and you say, I'm traumatized. Or you went to the store and the cookies that you were looking for, you come and you say, oh, it was so, I went to the store and they didn't have milk, it was traumatic. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just how the term has entered the parlance. It's sort of entered the lexicon in everyday society, and it's essentially intended to reflect something tough happened to me. That's essentially what it means in everyday usage. But trauma has a clinical definition that's actually quite important, and something as mental health professionals we use diagnostically to understand what it is we're dealing with in front of us. And so the clinical definition typically refers to an event that is of significant impact and creates sufficient fear to shatter one's sense of security in the world. And that's important. That sense of security, the idea that things are going to be okay, they are okay now, it probably will be okay, allows us to move around in the world. And when I wake up in the morning, I don't have to think about every single danger that lurks around me. I don't have to be in a sense of hypervigilance, because if we were in that state of hypervigilance, if we were worried about every single thing, if I was worried that if I was spending lots and lots of time thinking about what percentage possibility I might have that when I back my car out in the morning, something terrible could happen, I wouldn't be able to operate in the world. And so that sense of security we don't think about it, but it's crucial. Trauma impacts and it shatters that sense of security, either on a large scale or in specific domains. And so you can see without that sense of security, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to just operate very, very basically in the world. Yeah. That's trauma as we typically think about it. And so that's pretty terrible. It's, people struggle for many, many years with trauma, and this is why we have lots of different types of interventions that hopefully can be used to intervene. Collective trauma relates to an event of sufficient significance that it also creates a shattering of that sense of security. Now, it shatters that sense of security not through immediate acute exposure to the danger, right? To be subject to collective trauma, you need not have been exposed to a life-threatening event. Rather, what collective trauma does is it intrudes upon the sense of identity we have as part of a collective. And I'll explain what I mean by that, right? So part of our identity, part of how we define who we are, the story we tell about ourselves, part of that is based off of who I am specifically. I am a therapist and I am a father and I'm good at this and I'm good at that and I'm not so good at that, right? That is on a micro level that creates that sense of identity. But we also have a collective identity. I'm part of a group. That group can be defined at many different levels. So I'm part of Am Yisrael. I'm part of my Kihila. On the collective level, when a community experiences a trauma that intrudes upon that overall sense of security, it will filter down into the experienced, into the lived experience of each and every member of that community, or if not every single member of the community, that might be too overarching, to large segments of that population, and it will actually intrude upon that sense of identity. It impedes upon the story that we tell about ourselves. And once we impede upon the story that we tell about ourselves, right now we are beginning to talk about the basic sense of security that each and every one of us carry. Now, the events of October 7th was of such obviously large a scale, right? I'm speaking in absolutes and I don't want to, but many of us walked around feeling that sense of acute shock in the aftermath, right? And that came both from no matter how much we tried to filter what we saw, many of us still saw things that we didn't want to, but it also came from the new relationship we had with our collective, with our group, right? No matter how we define that, but Am Yisrael was under attack, and to the extent that we defined ourselves as part of Am Yisrael, as part of Eretz Yisrael, as part of the state of it, however we define that, there was an intrusion upon that story that we told about ourselves. And that impacted the basic sense of security. Beyond that, for many of us Jews, it impacted and it touched upon just archaic fears passed down through generations of uh, of violence and persecution. It ignited stories that we heard from our bubbies and zadies, and 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 ignited those fears that were sort of buried deep inside of us in a way that's difficult to operationalize. It's difficult to say exactly how it exists, but it's there. And so the impact of October 7th was experienced obviously on the acute level to those exposed directly, and to those who continue to be exposed directly to the trauma. But it's also experienced as a collective, and in that way filters down to each and every one of us. That's the background. Now we get to kids. So kids, especially when we're talking about young kids, for the most part, they're not following the ins and outs of the war. They're not tracking the news. They don't follow the minutia of what is going on, and it's also beyond that. It's difficult for them to conceptualize different levels of danger when they exist at such large levels, right? On the micro, they can understand, right? They can understand that if I jump off of a ledge that's too high, I'll probably hurt myself. That's scary, right? They can understand fear that exists in their minds, right? That there might be monsters under the bed. Those are fears that little kids can relate to, but it's very difficult to conceptualize fear that exists on a macro level. And so the collective trauma as adults experience is not experienced by children in the same way, right? They don't tell that same story as we as adults do. But what kids are very tuned into is us as adults, right? Kids don't achieve their state of security through an ongoing knowledge of what is safe and what is not, right? They're not tracking geopolitical events, and they're not tracking the stock market, and right, these are things that are beyond them. What they are tracking is the anxiety levels of the adults around them, right? There is endless amounts of research on this, right? But you could really just see this. You could run your own little experiment. You go into an elevator with a 4 or 5-year-old and watch a stranger come in. Right? A stranger represents some level of danger because it's unfamiliar. And what the kid will likely do is look at the stranger, be a little bit tense, not crazy tense because it's not that big of a danger, and then look at the parent. What they're doing is they're actually assessing the facial expressions and the body posture of their parent to assess for the danger that gives them a sense of what they are supposed to do, how they're supposed to feel in this moment. It gives them a sense of the level of security that exists in this moment. And that's crucial on so many different levels. But again, if we go back to just functioning, kids, even more than adults, rely on security in order to function, right? So a rule of thumb is that when things are stable for kids, they'll go out and do their job of exploring the world, which is a kid's job. Go out, do stuff, test their boundaries, challenge themselves. That's their job. Their job is to explore and figure stuff out. And they'll do that when they feel secure. When they don't feel secure, their job immediately switches to feeling secure. And they'll move away from exploring the world to going back and referencing the adults in order to make sure that they're stable. They don't think about this. They wouldn't be able to explain this to you, but this is what they do. And that's translated through very, very, very subtle cues. Again, once again, you can see this, and parents do this for the most part naturally, right? Take your kid to the park, go sit on the bench, and then watch him. He'll go off and he'll go and explore. He'll do stuff. And what he might do is he might try something that he hasn't tried before. Let's say he goes in the monkey bars for the first time. And what will likely happen in that moment is that either he'll go back or even he'll glance back at his mom and dad. And what he'll be looking for is that slight nod, a little smile, something to say, it's okay, go for it. That in that sense, he's metaphorically kind of filled up with security, and that is what gives him that push to then move on. And so you could sense the subtlety of these cues, right? The parent didn't say, "Oh, okay, I'm going to explain to you why the monkey bars are safe, and now you can go and do it," because it's not necessary. It's just the nod tells you, okay, now things are safe. So the way that kids right now are reestablishing their sense of security is by referencing their parents' sense of security. And this is where things come full circle to collective trauma. When parents are in states where they are feeling insecure, it will filter down to their children because their children are referencing them all the time. Now, what I don't want is for people to begin panicking and say, okay, I've got to get everything together and I've got to feel, completely secure right now. That just never works. Beyond that, we have to remember that kids are very, very resilient. They can tolerate moments of insecurity. They can tolerate uh, uh, challenges and difficulties, and they'll mostly bounce back. If we look back at Corona and everything that would happen in those times, there were certainly impacts, and kids got their learning intruded upon, and then maybe they're pushed back a little bit, and there may be kids who are really, really impacted, but for the most part, kids have been resilient and they've bounced back. So it's important to recognize that that we on one hand we shouldn't panic, but paradoxically, when we think about what is the best ways to help our kids with the overarching sense of trauma, right? How do we regulate our children's fears? It's by regulating our own, right? And that's not to say, again, I'll reiterate, it's not to say that we cannot be afraid. It is that the best way to regulate our children's fears is to begin to work on our own fears. It's to begin to work on our own sense of anxiety. And there's lots and lots, I won't go into that now. It's not the topic that we're talking about, but there's just lots of little things that one can do in order to regulate their own fear, to take care of themselves, such as, being attentive to their media diet and, maintaining a routine and exercising, all these nice little things that help us. And if necessary, going to therapy. But that paradoxically is the best way to help one's child with the collective trauma that we're all experiencing.
Right. So in a sense, is that specifically parents, or could be really any adult in their life that at the park, and
Yeah.
and so like how do we make sure that what it responds that parents should do for their own stress, or other caretakers, teachers, older siblings, I imagine also. So what
Right.
could they do
Well,
for the stresses that imposed by war?
so I mean, again, it's really the same for everybody, and yes, kids will reference the important people in their lives. That's, I guess, the best way to say it, and they'll reference them at in various degrees, right? One's a child's, I don't know, English teacher who they see twice a week may not, that won't have the same impact as an older brother, and an older brother may not have the same impact as a parent. So there are circles of proximity that influence the degree to which this is impactful. I mean, for the most part, when we see somebody else breaking down, the only thing that we can do for them, based off of the relationship that we have, is to see if they're okay. We can't really regulate other people. You can't just calm other people down. The most we can do is express concern. Excuse me. At the extreme, if we see someone in a kid's life who really, really is responding in ways that we feel not only don't support the kid, but actually actively enhance fear in some very, very sharp way. So then parents can be attentive to creating, effective boundaries, and making sure that kids have exposure to that person, in measured doses, and in times where things are more stable.
Right. Now, I've seen that in our crisis center. We opened up due to the war. We saw a lot of parents called in to discuss the issues of their kids, but when the social worker, whoever was dealing with the case, a lot of times felt that it was just giving the parents the tools that they needed, and after a couple sessions, the kids didn't need any help.
Yeah.
It was just the parents
Exactly.
in control.
It's a funny thing how, in general, at the clinic that I run, La Merchav Kav Le'Noar, very often what we find is that parents call in around children, but what they're really telling us is that we need some help, and for some funny reason, it's just societally more acceptable to bring kids in for therapy, and to bring kids in for help, ask for help for one's kids, than to ask for help for oneself.
Right, but I mean, could be that, I think honestly, parents could be they don't realize that. No, they think it
They
is
may
their
not
kid.
realize, but again, they may not realize that that itself is a complex statement. They may not realize because it's difficult to realize.
All right, that's for sure. Okay. Well, this reaction that children have, like, would you see a breakdown in different ages, in boys versus girls? Is it
Yeah.
affected differently by different people, different
Sure.
parts?
So up until now, I've been talking mostly about kids who are really not going to be exposed in direct ways to the events of the war. If we move towards teenagers, so teenagers are already getting to, and again, depending on the age of the teenager, depending on the level of sophistication, but teenagers are already getting some direct exposure to current events. Um, and so you have to be attentive to what it is that they actually know, what it is that they're following, and also quite importantly, how they know it. Um, uh, and so for teenagers, parents aren't. It's important not just to be aware and attentive to one's own reaction, but also to the ways in which teenagers are getting exposure um, to current events and how they are internalizing everything that's going on around them. And it provides an opportunity to discuss with teenagers what it is that they're hearing, how it is that they're taking in, and how it is that they understand it, what the medium is of their exposure to current events, what it is, what their medium is, right? Are they being told by are they going to school and kids are talking about it? Um, and it's a group of boys and they're each one's trying to be tougher than the other, and talking about how they're going to go to the army and shoot at whatever. And your kid's reaction, the kid may be having to play the game, but doesn't feel that way at all. And so it's important to understand the dynamics around that level of exposure. Uh, it's also important to remember with teenagers in general that while they are going to be getting a lot of support from their peer group, all the research shows us that adjustment and positive adjustment is highly correlated to the relationship that they have with their parents. And so it's important to find ways of being able to communicate with one's teenager about what's going on in the war. With respect to the question of girls versus boys, I mean, the basic breakdown of that, this is on a very broad level, but the basic breakdown is that when boys experience pain, they respond in what we call externalizing behaviors, right? They process their pain through externalizing it, getting into fights, destroying things, stealing, essentially causing a balagan. Whereas girls um, uh, largely process pain through internalizing behaviors, feeling depressed, cutting themselves, eating disorders, things that are more internally directed. Why that is an interesting question that many people have tried to answer, but that's typically the breakdown of how you'll see boys and girls. But once again, of course, there's lots and lots of variation when you get into each particular kid.
Well, what would be considered, let's say, the norm for a kid? There's normal day-to-day stress. There's a test next week in school is also could be a stress.
Yeah.
What's the norm, and when should a parent begin worrying that the child's response is outside the norm? And will the response always be that, oh, it means I'm anxious?
Well, no, it shouldn't always be. It's much more complicated than that. It shouldn't always mean that I'm anxious. When I say when what I was referencing at the outset is the most direct ways of intervention, right? I'm not talking about what we call the etiology, how it actually emerges, and the pathways towards emergence. Talking about the best ways of intervention. Um, with respect to the norms, I guess I would shift the terminology a little bit to levels of functioning. Right, what we're looking for, I'm less concerned about what the norm is, and more concerned with what the child's expected level of functioning is, and how much has that changed. Right, what we want from our kids is for them to, like I said before, to continue doing their jobs of exploring the world, right? And that means functioning on some level. Um, that has a connection to where they were pre-trauma. Uh, there can certainly be an allowance for, especially if you see that your kid is you can see directly that the kid is impacted. There can certainly be an allowance for some variation in functioning, but that should really be the benchmark. How did we observe the child functioning before, and how do we observe the child functioning right now? If there's a major shift, then this doesn't have to necessarily be a cause for concern, but it should be a signal to pay attention.
So would it be safe to say that if I don't see any major disruption in my child's life, daily life, and going around in anything, I would imagine little, disruption would be, understandable. If I don't see any major changes, then I could be rest assured that they'll be okay. They'll be resilient.
You can feel confident that things are likely fine. Again, one of the reasons it's important to maintain ongoing, the reason that people like me talk about communication with kids all the time, as difficult as it is because one way to recognize signals of distress in a kid is through their behavior. The other is through what they tell you. And so some kids, there's some kids who are better than others at hiding their distress. And so for those kids specifically, it's really important to be able to have the possibility of them actually just sharing something with you.
Okay. I hear. So that's very interesting. So are there any special areas of approaches I would see in my child, or I could assume, it'd be in all areas, whether it's in school, whether it's in extracurricular activities, because we've seen children who, some children are afraid to go out of the house, and some, in the beginning, some children go out of the house, but they don't function well in school. Like we see such a difference in response.
Right. That's kids manifest anxiety in different ways. Kids manifest distress in different ways. And so for some kids, it will manifest very, very directly, right? The fear. And for those kids, it's very difficult and very sad. But in some ways, it's encouraging that what you see is what you get. There's a fear and it manifests in the fear, right? And so when a kid won't leave his home, what we see there is that there is fear when the child is afraid, and they respond very directly to that fear. But fear can also manifest in intrusions in functioning because of the rule of thumb that I mentioned before, that when fear is regulated, you'll see kids beginning to explore and function. And when anxiety becomes prominent, their focus will become on managing that anxiety and ensuring the care that they need, and that you'll expect there to see some diminished functioning.
Mm-hmm. Now, hopefully everything should finish soon as of the war, but as a general point, like, could you assume that if a child made it pretty well till a certain point that he'll continue being okay? Or does the impact which is extended, would it finally catch up to him?
The way that I approach things is that if things in general, if things are going okay, statistically the most likely scenario is that things are going to continue going okay.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not necessarily based off of any special prediction, based off of expertise. That's just statistically that is likely how things will go. When parents come to me and ask me if I am worried about where their kid will be in 10 years, or if their kid will be okay in 10 years, or in 5 years, or in 2 years, what I will always say to them is I have no idea, right? And the reason I have no idea is because we're terrible at prognostication, right? Human beings are terrible, terrible, terrible at knowing what's going to happen 3 days from now, let alone 3 years from now. And so the idea of knowing or of trying to predict and prognosticate what is going to be, down the road is usually a fool's errand. It's a way that we try to calm ourselves by tricking ourselves into thinking that we can know the future. I mean, there's only Hashem knows the future,
right?
So, but we can rely on things being okay because they likely will be okay if they're okay right now.
Right. Okay. As I'm saying, they could have that little sense, like at the beginning of a trauma, I think they should be more worried than if everything's going normal.
Yes. It's never a good idea as a parent again, for exactly the reasons we spoke about at the outset, to be anxious when no anxiety is necessary.
Right. Okay. Good. And let's say there's a child who is showing a certain amount of fears and limitations, things. How do I navigate between pushing my child to continue functioning
Mhm.
and on the other end, but being supportive of his, fears and whatever he's expressing?
It's a difficult question to answer. I mean, I think the within the question lies the answer, right? There's some balance to that push, that pushing the kid to function, which is a necessary a task of a parent, and also being supportive and recognizing when to back off. I wish I had a great answer for that. I mean, there was I'll use a professional term here. This is based off of a Russian psychologist named I forget his first name, Vygotsky. He came up with this term called the zone of proximal development. The zone of proximal development is where we want to scaffold our kids, to push our kids just a little bit past what they can tolerate right now. And so if you think about giving a kid a puzzle, right? So if you're giving an 8-year-old a puzzle, and all he's done right up until now is 30-piece puzzles, and then you give him a 1,000-piece puzzle, I think, oh wow, once he'll do that 1,000-piece puzzle, then he'll really be a mumcha. He'll be an expert. But it never works like that. If you give a kid a 1,000-piece puzzle, he'll just look at the puzzle and throw things around and won't know what to do with it. In order to move a little bit past that, and for him to develop his puzzle solving abilities, you have to give him a 50-piece puzzle. So so much of being a parent is finding that zone of proximal development, where what is the right measure to push those kids, because it's not good as a parent to just always let kids just be and always be supportive. That's only part of our role. Part of the role of parent is to find that zone that is appropriate for where kids can be pushed.
Mhm. I hear. So the answer would be like a general parenting rule that always pushing him a
Yeah,
little
it's
bit without too much.
right,
Finding
right.
that thing. Okay, great. And what if we would see signs of distress, but the child denies that there's a problem?
Mhm.
But we
Yeah,
see
that's
that
pretty
the
common.
problem.
That is pretty common. Especially, I mean, it's really with girls and boys, but I think especially with boys, it's not cool to have problems. Uh, um, it's a complicated question. I mean, the first thing is that it's important to have patience. It's many parents get very understandably nervous that if they don't intervene right now, it's going to become a snowball and things are going to deteriorate. And in some cases that's true, but in most cases it's not. Uh, you know, you intervene at the level of an emergency when there's an actual emergency. But sometimes intervention can actually have detrimental impact. Often parents come to me and bring their kids for therapy. Um, and unless if their kid doesn't want to come to therapy, if their kid doesn't want to see me, and continues to not want to see me after a session or two, what I'll usually tell the parents is that we're probably going to do more damage now than benefit by having him continue to see me. And that's for a number of reasons, including for the fact that if he has a bad experience in therapy at present, he'll be less likely to take advantage of it later on down the road when he might be more amenable. Um, and so it's important not to there are many, many, many ways to intervene outside of therapeutic intervention. Um, and that's parents can go and consult with a Rav or with a therapist or with for this particular kid, what is the best way to be supportive? And sometimes that means spending more time. Sometimes it means backing off a little bit. Sometimes it means giving kids different opportunities than they've had before. But there's lots and lots of ways to intervene beyond just giving therapy.
Mm-hmm. I hear. Well, so I'm going to maybe expand that a little more then. Well, what if, let's say, a parent finds that the challenges, I mean, we just kind of discussed this to an extent in the beginning, but what if the challenges that a child is struggling with are the exact challenges that either one or both of the parents are struggling with? How do they model, the proper coping strategies to the children when they themselves are struggling with the same issues? It's not
Right.
necessarily just this topic, but it could be on any
Sure.
issue.
Sure. Well, I mean, I, I don't mean to be pithy, but if you can't model something that you're not doing.
Right.
So you can't model coping. If you're not coping, then you can't model coping. But what you can do, there are many, many parents who are just not coping with the current situation. Um, it's really, really, really hard, and all of us can understand. There are days where you wake up and everything seems bleak, and you try to find any source of inspiration that you could find, and it becomes very, very difficult. And there are gradations of how intense that is, and for some people, that's just an ever-present, ongoing experience. Um, and if you're not coping, you can't just go and cope, right? For if you're really in a state of difficulty, it takes time to get out of it. Now, and so you can't model functioning if you can't function. Um, what you can do is be open about the struggle to get back to functioning, to get back to a state of regulation. There's a patient that I'm working with, and I have his. I thought he might come up in our discussion here today, and so I asked his permission to obviously not reveal his identity, but to share his story. He was pre the war, he was a super high functioner and somebody who was sort of a go-getter in the extreme. He was somebody who he looked at challenges and he said, and they excited him. They said, if you told him that he couldn't do something, he said, well, now I'm going to do it. And that was kind of his identity, and his kids knew that about him. And then October 7th happened, and for lots of different reasons that I've been talking with him about him, he completely collapsed. And getting out of bed was difficult, and he couldn't work, he couldn't do the things that he enjoyed before. When he tried to do those things, he didn't enjoy them. He fell into a deep depression that was very, very sad and really, really debilitating. So constantly dealing with anxiety. But what was inspiring about the way that he handled it is that he never for a moment tried to hide what he was going through from his family, from his kids. And to his surprise, he was he kind of it just didn't go with his nature to hide it, but he was very nervous about how his kids would relate to him. And to his surprise, what he found was that it didn't change his relationship with his kids even a little bit. He was surprised just by how much things just kept on going, and it put a lot on his wife. And again, I don't mean to be Pollyannish about this. I don't mean to paint this in to be overly rosy and optimistic. It's extraordinarily difficult. But in terms of how he was related to by his family and by his kids just saw him as somebody who was as their father who they knew before, who right now is really, really struggling. They know that he was open about going to therapy, and he's open about trying to get back on his feet. And they know that about him. And that is, they admired him before for being able to overcome every obstacle. And they admire him now for attempting to overcome this extraordinarily difficult obstacle that's impeding his functioning. So that's what can be modeled. If you can't model ongoing functioning, what you can model is courageously dealing with the anxieties and the impacts of the trauma.
I mean, that alone is a tremendous lesson. Like, let's just say, would you think that if, let's say, the father tried to hide it, then the children would have probably sure picked up on it, and then that's what would have made them nervous. But the fact that the father was open, the anxiety maybe didn't funnel down to them. Whereas if it would have,
absolutely. Right. Again, I'm sure that the kids, it doesn't make the kids feel great. It's not nice to see your father laid out in bed. But absolutely, I agree with you completely. I think the fact that he was so open and honest with this is what allowed his kids to say, to get back to what is crucial, what we've been talking about since the beginning here, is that basic sense of security of it will be okay.
Right. I mean, that some thought has been eye-opening, that we see the definition of how it affects the person's security, and even the collective of this, and even by children, how it affects their security as opposed to the parents. That's and this I'm sure could be applied to regular ongoing parenting too. It's
absolutely, yeah. I mean, what we're going through right now is extraordinarily different, but it's the same principles as always.
Right. And you mentioned before, something to address a point. I mean, I'm not sure if there's how much we can really control this, but I'll bring about it anyways because we do get this question a lot, and I'm going to put it towards you. Is that parents want to know how much should they or should they not discuss with their children? Like, okay, so here the case you're talking about, he discussed how he related to it. But as far as, let's say, you brought before the teenagers who get a lot of information from outside, let's say people, how much even for teenagers should they limit to them what they could see, what they should be hearing, or younger children for sure, how much should they could they talk about? On one hand, you know, they have to face reality. There is something going on. On the other hand, maybe talking too much. Like, is there a rule of thumb?
I wish I had a principle that was hard and fast and could be could be applied across the board. But there is so much variation. There's variation in age. There's variation in the particular community that you're associated with. There's variation on the level of the personality of each child. There are some children that are more curious and more enterprising than others. Um, I guess the one principle that I could put forth, which I suppose is intuitive, is that there's no use for parents to try to hide things that kids are going to find out anyway. Um, if there's some inevitability, uh, for example, if a child comes from a community where there are, where many of the men or the boys are in Gaza, um, there's no sense in telling a child who has some level of understanding that there's no danger. Uh, the kid knows this. He's going to find this out, right? Telling him, "Oh, it's all going to be fine. Everything's going to be okay." You don't know this, and he knows you don't know this. And all that does is makes you a less credible source of information. Now, on the other hand, even if inside what's going on is you're saying, "Oh my God, I can't believe it," and I'm scared every single moment. That's not something that's useful in any way to share with a child, and you don't have to go into the specific locations of each boy in your community and where he's located, where his unit is located in Gaza. Uh, right, that's not information that's necessary, but at the very least, information that kids are going to find and are going to know. There's really no reason to try and hide that.
Right. So he has to take a lot of factors into account. Like, where's his community? Where's
Yeah.
his child holding? What's he going to find out? And he has to be a chacham. Like,
That's so yeah. I mean, the good thing about chachma with parenting, at least what I found, is that so much of it is it's really difficult, but a lot of it is intuitive.
right.
That's when people
Yep.
as a therapist, people assume that I'm there to give advice, and I typically don't do that because I don't have much good advice to give. I can help people test their assumptions and tune into their intuitions, but mostly it's thinking carefully about it and then trusting what comes intuitively.
Right. That's a good point. People have to learn to trust their intuitions in these things.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Trust it while thinking about the intuitions, because intuitions aren't always correct, but
Right.
but intuitions are a decent guide.
Okay. And what do you say? So let's say a person's considering seeking therapy for a child, right? They want to seek the help for a child. Maybe the child's hopefully open to a little bit, but what does therapy really help us? A lot of people are skeptical about therapy as it is, and sometimes they don't realize it takes to find the right therapist, like a shidduch. You got to find the right shidduch,
Sure.
and so sometimes so what could parents know about that, and how much they could find therapy that would be effective? What could they count on, and the like?
So therapy with kids can be effective. Therapy is never always effective, even with adults. Um, but especially with a kid, one-on-one therapy with a child can be useful. it can be useful in a number of different ways based off in there, there's so many different approaches and ways of intervention that I won't get into right now. Um, but therapy one-on-one with a kid uh, can be effective and can be very important. But the other thing that parents can do when taking a child to when their child is experiencing difficulty and needs therapy is that they can go get therapy for themselves as well. Uh, therapy can be a forum where they can discuss their own functioning as parents, as individuals, their relationship with their kids. It's a place to think, and that actually is often an even more useful intervention when a child is experiencing difficulty. For example, in our clinic in La Merchav Kav Lenoir, when parents come for therapy around their child, it is a given that parents are going to be part of the process. How they're part of the process, in what way, and what mode of intervention, that's something that we determine based on, off of an assessment. But parents are always involved, and that's known from the beginning.
Mhm. Okay. Because I've heard in different forms from different parents that, they had a childhood and, as one person put it, they were put together in a room with the parents and the school staff and the principal and everybody's put together. And they asked him, maybe you want to talk to somebody.
Yeah.
And he remembers thinking, talk about what? As an adult, he's thinking, now I could think I probably should have talked to somebody. But
Right.
then he remembers thinking, what do they want me to talk about?
It's so that's actually a really important point, and I'm glad you mentioned it as it relates, especially with children, but even with younger teenagers. Therapy with a child is not about talking to somebody. Children's primary mode of communication is not verbal. Uh, young children in therapy play with the therapist. That is their mode of communication. And so it's also you could talk to the therapist about how to introduce it to the child, because that's also going to be based off of the particular sensitivities of what's going on in the nature of the child. But especially with a young child and even with a young teenager, it shouldn't be brought up as you want to talk to somebody. That's when you recommend that to an adult, that's the way to introduce it, but not to a child.
So the way it was introduced was wrong. So they
But
told him,
also but I'll add that's what you're also articulating is the difficulties with therapy with a child. Right? The child comes into the therapy room and this is this big adult who they don't know. It's quite difficult. And this as somebody who works with children or I in the past I've done a lot more work with children than I do now, but that's one of it's one of the risks involved in working with kids, and it's something that therapists have to be very, very much attuned to. And again, parents going into therapy have to know that the answer that they get from the therapist at this moment may be now is not the right time.
mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. Okay, look, it's been very enlightening. Is there any other messages or last words like to share with us?
Just what I said before, kids are very, very resilient. Kids can experience difficulty and they can experience lots of distress. Uh, but kids are resilient, even without outside intervention. Kids are typically quite resilient, and that should be heartening to parents. That it doesn't mean that we shouldn't intervene, but it means we can be thoughtful about those interventions, and we don't have to intervene with massive levels of urgency.
Right. So there's 2 points: the fact that a lot of children are resilient, and then even if they see there might be an issue, there's a lot that can be done for a child.
Yeah, so a lot can be done, and it can be and should be done, and the resilience of the kids allows us to be thoughtful about those interventions.
Right. I mean, I see Baruch Hashem, I think this whole idea of issues, this whole stigma that used to be a lot stronger has disappeared from our community, in a very large to a large extent.
Yeah.
So, it should just
Yeah,
continue.
I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think again, I think if I may say so, I think it's organizations like Epic that have paved the way for that stigma to recede. I think that the fact that people can see that it's not so scary to pay attention to mental health. I think that's
Right.
that's due to the efforts of organizations like yours.
Right. Baruch Hashem. We only see people are relieved from the fact, not regretting it.
Yes, yes, agreed.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I found that very enlightening. Wish you lots of continued hatzlacha and everything.
You're
And
very, very welcome, and thank you for inviting me.
okay.